Uh, it's fabulous to be back here again at Assab One, and for me, Milan is now more home. I don't even want to say second home anymore. And thank you for, thank Elena for being an incredible and wonderful host. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming for this presentation. What I'm going to share with you more is this idea of landscape, and for me, the idea that one's own self as landscape, as a point of reference in space. So these are a series of images that are not really, has not quite anything to do with architecture or art, but it has everything to do with that too. And so my interest really lies in through what one experiences, what one observes, as a way to understand one's own self. So anyway, so it's a series of atmospheres. Celine, this doesn't play. Okay. Nope. Sorry. Again, these are videos and pictures taken of what I experienced. I use where I live as a way to sort of understand, culture, cultivation. And so this is actually a weaving technique in Bengal, and it's been around like this for quite some time now. And it's a textile which is, I think, about 50 meters long. And it's really setting up the warp and weft. This idea of warp and weft and how, this idea of weaving. For me, this is something that is evolved. I think it's been a kind of organic process of this idea of a collective, of how people come together in making something. And the idea of the author in some way is embedded, in this sort of much larger construct. So I've started with this particular video just as a way to talk about what we do as, a cultural weaving, this idea of weaving, this idea of warp and weft. So this guy is basically setting these, marks. I think it basically is the size of the textile. But this entire textile is woven by hand in this manner. So this is really the weaving loom. And you can still see these kind of practices. For me, what's interesting is also this idea of imprint, of how they occupy the landscape. And of course, how it is connected to what I would say a tidal flux. Again, for me, it's been very important. It's more something that I'm interested in. How do I go to the next slide? Okay. I don't know. Okay, good. For me, this idea of lunar time, and I think, more so anywhere, any other place, I think Italy also, just in the fact of the way wine is grown, it's tied to the tidal flux, to the waxing and waning of the moon. And that, I think, is something that collects us as a global culture. That's really the origin of where we all come from. It's sort of very recent, a few hundred years, 400-500 years, as we were colonized because the seas were taken, Greenwich Mean Time was introduced, the way we understand time. And again, my interest, like in India, and I'm the same thing I experience in Italy, this, this idea of language and gesture and understanding, where, so I'm sure if you've been to India or you have Indian friends, we kind of do this. You ask a question and then you get this kind of nod like that. And it's this, and you don't quite know, is it yes? You don't quite know, it's no. And then depending on how quickly it goes, you can, again, so for me, that I'm describing this gesture more as a sense of ambiguity, and I'm sure in Italy it's exactly very similar. When you say something, there's a great sense of body language and gesture, and more than just words, things are being communicated through the eyes and through the hands and through the movement of the body. And that whole idea that the body as a construct of architecture, I happen to be trained as an architect. That was what I studied. But for me, the interest is that's just a process or a method in some way to communicate. And so at this moment in time, and I don't want to, define it as art and architecture, but the fact that one can operate outside certain boundaries that we actually give ourselves. But anyway, coming back, this idea of lunar cycle, because it's a seasonal flux. It's very embedded in the culture. It allows for negotiation. It allows for barter. And in these, basically, I think there are words that I'm going to, share with you that in some way inhabit me, and this idea of, why we make the things that we make, or why do we do the things that we do. But if I just quickly read this, water, a colorless, transparent, odorless liquid, which forms the seas, lakes, rivers, and rain, and is the basis of the fluids of living organisms. Air, the invisible gaseous substance surrounding the earth, a mixture mainly of oxygen and nitrogen. This last one, this particular one is quite, I like the quality of the idea of light, the natural agent that stimulates sight and makes things visible. This is quite interesting. This is actually in a place called Gujarat, in a place called Surat. It's a city that's now booming. We're 1,200,000,000 people. Economy is moving at a rapid pace. The cities are being urbanized. And so if you imagine, a migration of 1,200,000,000 people between rural and between the urban. But more importantly, this idea of, self-reliance, or finding a moment where they can operate. And it's not about legality or illegality, but they find this zone where there's ambiguity. So these are fishing boats. They don't have their motors, which then enables them during low tide to basically go out into the estuary and then dredge the sand. And then again, in high tide, these boats return back, and it's just the movement of the tidal flux. It's a completely, informal industry, and you can see that's them returning in high tide, and you can see the trucks on the right. Oops, sorry. The trucks there, and this idea of economy. What I'm interested in is, how do we enable ourselves to maintain a sort of discipline of self-expression, even in times when, what we call frameworks or sort of methods are very clearly defined by what is prevalent at that time. And if you take this idea of, the economy, and how architecture, that's what I've been observing, is that architecture is actually dictated by something else, not by really architecture, but another kind of economy that we all have to fall in line with. So again, this interest for me was this idea of, observing things in the landscape that in some way demonstrate another method, another way that's outside a sort of confined framework. And, this is something that I connected to, was this idea of, lunar time, cyclical time. And as this material actually comes in on land and then goes into the cities, to construct cities, sorry, again, it's interesting because this idea of farming, and for me, that's farming. It's this, cultivation of a landscape. These are sort of salt fields. In fact, yesterday, at dinner, we were talking about very similar landscapes here in Italy that exist. I use air, water, light because I think that's what we are made up of. And the whole pursuit being in celebration of that, in this idea that can one make things, can one do things? And for me, the importance of these ingredients, that if I stray as close to them, as close to these sort of the nature, the phenomena of it, it in some ways a representation of life, a representation of the environment that surrounds us. And again, like I said, it's more like this idea of contact that's being made. So anyway, these are just slides taken by a collaborator in the studio. They sort of go out and look at these landscapes. And for me, it's interesting. Did I move? No. And so one of the phenomena that, I have come to recognize, and I'm often asked this question in a lot of discussions about, how do you transfer something? Because India's looked at as a sort of place where all these things can occur. And I think it's kind of rooted to this idea of economy again. And for me, the interest actually is that there are great similarities, culturally across continents that still exist. It's just that our eyes or our view has been moved away from that. And what does it mean really in terms of how it enables, us to be cultural beings? So anyway, this is salt pans. I just want to give you the sense of the quality of the landscape. We did a similar piece. For me, it's kind of tied to this idea of salt and Gandhi, when we were colonized. And during the British rule, there was what was called the Salt March, where, he walked to this particular site. And this idea of being, free from a system that wants to, in some way, box you in. So I think that for me has been a sort of influence in more the idea or the thought of what it means to have the freedom of self-expression. So again, a lot of the work that you see downstairs in some way is an archive or a documentation of what I'm experiencing. How does one in some way articulate what one experiences, and so the techniques that are used are, in fact, all the materials come from these ingredients, air, water, and light. Everything comes from nature and has the capacity to go back to it again. The important thing here is, that what I've discovered is this idea of I wouldn't say it importance, but I would say why we're here. I often ask myself this question, and I'm putting it forward. Why did the caveman paint? What was it? There were no galleries. There was no, curators. There was none of that, right? And what prompted them to act in the way that they did? And I think, for me, that's actually really where the pursuit lies, this idea of, making a mark. And that's what I think I've discovered, is that in some way or in some capacity, however simple the gesture might be, nurturing a plant, making a great meal for your family. I mean, all of them have that quality about expression and communication. And again, these are things that, in my view, are ethics, if you want to call it that traverse cultures, that traverse time. But anyway, what I like, these are quite sculptural, the objects, but the kind of marking of the hand, to imagine that the hand has gone to shape this, and you see these sort of lines out there. Another thing, it's not that I'm preoccupied with the hand as a sort of nostalgic moment, but to recognize that our first communications, the first communication or the first contact that was made when I think all of us, when we came into being, when we came into this planet, the first thing that touched us was the hands. And this is only something I've discovered as doing the work. It partly came at that time living slightly outside Mumbai. We didn't have electricity, so obviously machinery was difficult to operate. So you were really reliant on what you could do with your hands and body, and it sort of evolved from that. But through this process of evolution, I was always curious, like why, what about the hand? And for me, it's that moment of communication of sort of empathy. I don't know. I mean, I think there's a certain sort of tactile quality. And oftentimes we forget that, we're more and more living in an age of industry. I'm sure it is going to get even more complex. And I'm interested in sort of imagining this idea of, what happens or what can be the possibility if we lose our hands. What kind of world do we live in? And again, it's just a speculation. It's got nothing to do with these particular pictures. In some ways, it does still have a lot to do with these images. Lore, a body of traditions and knowledge on a subject or held by a particular group, typically passed from person to person by word of mouth. The second definition for me is really of interest. Actually both, but the second one, the space between the eye and the base of the bill of a bird, or between the eye and nostril of a snake. I like this because it's about perception. Where do we perceive things from? And this idea of, something that I'm interested in, was talking a little earlier this evening, what, this foray, if you want to call it. And again, I'm saying it's not art, but what I discovered in that is that, there's an intuitive self, that's very responsive. And the moment the intuition arises within oneself, at that moment in time, at least this is my personal observation, there is a contact, but it comes with a sense of skepticism or self-doubt, and so this whole idea of, practicing or doing these things that one has seen downstairs, or what we did for 2 weeks here in the studio, was in some way to give up that prejudice, and to remain in this action of doing and of intuition. But anyway, so lore carries tacit knowledge through past, present, and future. Answers to each time lie in its appropriation. Most importantly, it is intuitive and rational, subjective and objective at the same time, essential to both survival and nourishment of mankind. This is something I discovered, and I'm kind of running a parallel because I know that this also occurs here in your country, in Italy, where a lot of things are passed on just by language or by symbols, and not necessarily, written down. So they don't become instructions. And I'm interested in that, passing on this sort of culture of symbols and signs and gestures as a way of, passing on. But it's interesting. And so my preoccupation also is this idea of how do you accommodate error, this idea of error, because I think error comes in the idea of communication or miscommunication, because oftentimes, you can discuss something or and talk about something, and each one has their own way of receiving it and then acting or interpreting what one has said. And I think the whole journey of the studio, or my being in the studio, was for me to observe that, because there's a point where, sometimes we can get very strict and tight and you want things to be in a certain way. But the forces that are around don't actually enable it to be in that way. And so again, this whole idea of, lack of prejudice, I think for me the aesthetic lies in the lack of prejudice of something that is predetermined, and and this idea of making that is really in the present. And the whole practice of this is, how does one retain that quality of space? This is quite interesting. So we're, there's a sort of boom in the economy, hundreds and hundreds of years of civilization that's changing very fast, and so it's like compacted time, 15 years, a lot of things have changed. And this particular slide, the image on the left, it's this idea of displacing time, in terms of when you look at the object itself, where you have this ramp. Oops, sorry about that. This ramp, and what that does is enables a motorcycle, which is, treated as a piece of furniture that's brought in every evening after work into the sort of center of the house. And a celebration of that kind of movement. Again, being confronted, and, oftentimes, if I'm in Japan or actually everywhere, this idea that things are being lost. And I'm of the view that, things are not really lost, they're only obscured in time. Because again, it's rooted in a sensibility, it's rooted in calling for things that at some point have inhabited our atmosphere. So I'm of the opinion that nothing is lost, it's only obscured in time. And this particular piece where the steps and the ramp come together in a sort of very seamless way, this idea of, two economies, two ways of being, two ways of understanding time, and the way they actually come to overlap. So not really in conflict, but this idea of how they can coexist very seamlessly together. And in that process, they are able to become as things that are more present, and anyway, so the next slide is, or the next image here on the right is, it's a place called Hampi. This was several years ago. I'd taken this picture, and again, it was, just a beautiful sculptural object, and that was really the intent of me taking this picture. And of course, later on, I discovered that these holes actually were made to drive wooden pegs inside them, and then water was poured, and the entire rock was kind of split in half. And an entire city, it was not so long ago, only 15th century, 500 years ago, this entire civilization was built out of just one material and pretty much two instruments, if you want to call it that. So this is a granite stone quarry in the south of India, 70 kilometers from Chennai. And they actually harvest the stone, or, this whole entire place has been hand cut in the way that you saw, only two instruments, and still being practiced today. And it's interesting because this particular method and the material is actually sold as slabs for septic tanks and for fencing. It's like the most inexpensive material that is available. But for me, it's not about the economy behind it. It's about actually what's embedded in that method. This idea of embodied energy in a subject or in an object, where the process of doing in some way informs, what emerges from that. So I've been very fascinated this idea of actually being able to do full-scale, like line drawings, very much like the threads that we had downstairs, or the textile, where you could pretty much draw the project on the ground, and it's like a tilt-up slab. There's a sort of immediacy of how it sort of emerges out of this, I guess, mountain or rock. Again, just atmospheres. This is a quarry in the north of India, in the northwest, in Rajasthan. It's a place which is a desert, primarily a desert. It's not meant to rain. And it was just this moment of being able to see these quarries, capture this water. And you can see these, these pavilions. that have been built, with very rudimentary means. There are actually pavilions that are used for shelter and for rest. And as they move through this landscape, these pavilions are kind of, in some sense, left behind. They're not, I won't say that they're in use or not used, but, they continue to exist. And so there's a whole landscape of these buildings, very basic in the way that they're put together, and all depending on weight, on gravity. I think, this idea of gravity being an equanimous, egalitarian force, which we are all confronted with. So it's interesting, this relationship of our experiences of forces that are applied on us, and likewise how they're applied in things that we make or things that we do. So we did, in fact, we did send from that granite quarry. It's in Milan. It was at the Hangar Bicocca, I think it was last year, where we did a show, and we actually transferred this granite method and made a small little pavilion. I don't know if it is up, but anyway, that's just to this idea of domesticity, and how the landscape, the immediate landscape, is utilized to make space. Affection, it is the ability to observe and to identify with another's situation or condition, and to then care for it and protect it, in the hope to provide it with what it needs to be itself. I think this is an ingredient, that, or an ethos that we all collectively have, cross boundaries. And I've suggested these are words that we've taken, words that sort of show up, and then we try and explore the dictionary and put together these words, but in some way to communicate the quality of what that word holds in itself. So this, for me, is an incredible image. She was the protagonist for our piece at the Venice Biennale, or the pieces downstairs. And truly this idea of, self-reliance, young lady, incredibly beautiful, but what she's doing is actually, is making a silk thread. She's actually winding, a silk thread and making thread from that. But this whole idea of, all the things that inhabit, or all the things that surround her, are all, objects, be it this is a sort of clay hob, if you want to call it that. And that's the bed. It's called a charpa. It's, I think, the only sort of seminal piece of furniture that culturally we've had, where, you are born on that, you get married on that, and then you also you die in there, in the sense that this piece of furniture in some way embodies the cycle of life and death. And talking about that, for me, the interest lies in how do we make things that go beyond our lifetime, that have the capacity to sort of traverse time. And hence, what I've come to recognize, it's these ingredients, affection and manner and posture, all of these ingredients that in some way enable the possibility of traversing time. Because I think this is something that we have experienced, over generations, over centuries. And so these words become very important in terms of the quality of the space that they construct within ourselves. That's the street. This is an extremely hot climate. It's desert country, and it uses nature, it uses the landscape, it uses, the relationship of man and animals. So it's not man and nature, but man in nature, or nature in man. And at least that's my own belief about, how we are or who we are. Manner, from the French manière, substantivized use of the adjective meaning done with one's hands. a notion which reveals a method of execution or way of doing, especially with regards to the outward manifestation of an embodied process. Posture, the word comes from the Latin verb ponere, which means to put or place. To observe this concept implies an implicit understanding of the carriage of the body as a whole, its approach, attitude, or the positioning of the arms and legs in relation to the object which is being manipulated. This slide, and that's, I'm sort of, I liken this slide to this idea of, postures in architecture. And this was something that was raised, as a question in my mind. In 2010 at the Venice Biennale, we were to do this black cement screeded floor. And, we asked the local, the people who were there, and they brought back a can of black paint. And we said, no, and that's not what we were wanting to communicate. But importantly, what it meant was that we actually had to sit down on the floor, like on our haunches, and we were 6 or 7 carpenters, one American apprentice at that time, myself. And it required you to actually sit on the floor and work the floor for like 2 or 3 hours, like, on your haunches, and you work like that. Of course, the carpenters who I had, who had come from India, they were able to do that because culturally, they occupied the ground. They had understood how to position their body and conduct themselves in the work that they did or in the life that they lived. They were both integrated as a way of, participation. But the question that I'm raising really is, what if the postures that we take, disable or enable, methods of making, methods of expression that we have had. So, materials will exist, the know-how exists, but it's just in the manner or in the posture of how we participate that what we call things are being lost. So it's for me a very beautiful slide because, it's also this idea of the space in between, full contact of hand, mind, and body, and then also in contact with what is being made. And, you cannot separate them. They're all connected and at the same time detached. But yes, this for me is the gesture, the in-between space. Again, it's, when one talks about industry, I think what we're all confronted with, and I think it's a human, I wouldn't say it's a human problem, but it's a human condition. This idea of rate of change, our capacity to change, to let go, and at the rate at which we can do that. So I think that idea of speed and how to negotiate speed comes from this idea of rate of change, our own internal capacity to in some way let go. And so again, going back to the idea of prejudice, that the moment one practices, giving up an idea of a predetermined aesthetic or the loss of prejudice, that itself is the aesthetic in a sense. Gravity, the force that attracts a body towards the center of the earth or towards any other physical body having mass. In Newton's theory, gravity makes particles leave their straight paths. In Einstein's theory of general relativity, gravity is distortion of space-time. Particles still flow the straightest possible paths in that space-time. But because space-time is now distorted, even on those straightest paths, particles accelerate as if they were under the influence of what Newton called the gravitational force. And it's quite interesting because, it's this idea of, coming together and moving away, this idea of, of what we experience up in the sky. Again, I've made these up and I'm going to share them with you unabashedly. And one of the things that I've come to understand, is, and I'm saying that the will to imagine, I'm going to repeat that, the will to imagine is greater than imagination itself. I think the operative word here is will. And I'm using that as a way to understand our notion of gravity because, no, it's not true that, when we're born that we will automatically walk. It's not true at all. It's something that is imagined within us. It's I wouldn't say it's instinct either, it's, because we know we've all grown up and we've fallen 100 times, before we've learned to walk. So the whole act of walking is not something that is what we're meant to do. I think it comes from that idea of a possibility or an imagination. And anyway, so these are sort of objects. I've tried to make a connection. I don't know if it can make, but I'm going to try. These are beautiful structures, and in fact, you see one suspended in the space right at the end. It's called a tazia. It's done by the Muslim community. I can say for certain in India and in Pakistan and in Bangladesh, at least I'm aware of that. I'm not sure if it happens in other places, but this celebration actually takes place it's called Muharram, the days of mourning, and it's the last day. But during that process, during that month and something, they make these structures, and a group of people get together. It's all word of mouth. There's one conductor of the entire crew out there. There are children, there are grandparents, relatives, friends, people that live around. And they basically celebrate their saint. These are sort of structures that I call, of ascension or descension, depending on how you want to perceive them. Going up to the sky or actually coming from the sky down. And when I came across these, it kind of reminded me of a mock-up of the Apollo 11 spacecraft. And actually that's what actually caught my curiosity, was this sort of object. And when one thinks about it, it really is about that, this idea of, of the understanding of the sky. I often, again, this is something, having lived in Alibag and, coming into contact with the night sky, And I think in cities, what has transpired is sort of like a schism, a disconnection from the way that we experience the sky. It often takes us, or we have to go to sort of more rural parts of the country where there's not light pollution. And so when you look at the sky, and again, this is, just my own made up story, if you want to call it that, where I say that, the sky is a mirror reflection of the earth, or the reverse. And what I mean by that is that if you look at this idea of the sky and the celestial nature of it, there are more stars out there up in the sky that inhabit the sky than every living organism on this earth, including insects. So this idea of back and forth, of our perception of where is it that we truly are. And so anyway, this for me is really become an important part. I'm not an astronomer, I'm not an astrologer, I don't know very much, but somehow to feel this kind of contact, which is sort of this idea again of traversing space and time, just the sense of distance. And when you think about it, you require distance to view something, I think what is present right now is our inability to read language or symbols, what is being written out there in some way, just the idea of the waves that overlap, the beaches, the imprints that are formed, And I'm saying this because it's quite interesting. There's a snake tribe, there's a tribe still in south of India that actually believes the origins of where they come from is from the snake. And it's quite interesting. And so they're able to, just like a broken blade of grass on the ground, and they can tell you the size of the snake, how long ago did it pass through, all of that. And that's what I mean, that these are these patterns, that exist. It's just our inability to be able to understand them. And again, it's not, have I gone too forward? So yeah, this one is actually, it's a local fair in Bombay, but just the quality of the way they're able to construct a kind of imaginary city is just sort of like Calvino-esque kind of city where these contraptions, that come up for a few weeks and then get dismantled and then reappear in some other landscape. So this idea that how they're able to move, move through different varying landscapes and through different periods through the year, but have the ability to continue, communication of this sort of reverie, if you want to call it. Again, for me, they kind of suggest other things. It's a place that you come to celebrate as a fair, and you can look at it like that. But these sort of the markings or the way they sort of denote it with these lights, it's also suggestive of some other things. And it's quite beautiful because when they take these tazias out, and so these are basically structures made out of bamboo. They're tied with a cotton thread or sometimes with the intestines of a goat. And then they're packed with mud. The joints, so the nodes are sort of packed with clay or mud. And at the end of that day of mourning, they take these processions out towards a lake or a river, and the structures are put in, and then obviously with the water, the whole structure kind of dissolves. The mud dissolves, the rope gives way, and it kind of goes back into the ground. And then they start the cycle again next year. Not again, like I said, not that different from farming, that whole idea of a cycle of life. Angle of repose, the angle of maximum slope at which a heap of any loose solid material will remain in place without sliding. State of rest. Here I'm just showing you like a series of images of earth mounds, that idea. And I'm using that as a way to describe, the posture of the body being at its most economical position, where all the forces in some way are sort of aligned, so the sort of center. And also this idea of, man as rocket. We have these moments, in a few hundred years ago, where these beautiful, very precise sculptures cut out of stone, and some of them are a few 100 feet high. And what I came to recognize were these were actually symbols in some way of like this idea of a rocket, that idea of propulsion, that these people were actually moving towards. So that whole practice of this idea of propelling yourself into another sense of time. So these are, it's again an informal industry, mostly done by farmers in their fields. In the summertime, they prepare the bricks, and of course and then the monsoons come, and then they start cultivating once again. So I'll just quickly go back. Yeah, you can see, there are patches of these green squares that they're using just before the rains come in. This image is quite interesting. And our ability to think in the reverse. So this was something that caught my curiosity. It's a restoration of a Mughal emperor called Humayun. It's his tomb in Delhi, and I happened to be there and saw this incredible structure here on the left, which is in some way, if you want to call it the positive or negative, it's the form work. So they build this very quickly, and then that's what you get. And so this idea that, when one talks about the idea of practicing the idea of form or a prejudice, this idea of the ability to think in the reverse. So what you're thinking about is the negative space as opposed to the positive one. And both of them can be still relevant in their opposition or in their difference, that idea of negative and positive. So it's something that got me thinking that you actually can develop buildings thinking about the formwork and not actually the actual shape of the building itself. And you allow that formwork in some way to, define what eventually occurs in the process of, doing this. It's very quick, it's super easy. It's just brick with mud mortar, and then this thing is dismantled. So these are just drawings of bricks. I've been interested in bricks more recently because, billion, 200 million people, population that large, more than 50% of the landscape is built without us architects, and they make incredible buildings. And so I'm very conservatively saying that we at least, and it's very pessimistic, we have probably about 20 to 30 million bricklayers at our, to our sort of access. So the idea of, remaining in this contact with the earth, and how that is made, the idea of gravity, the weight, this idea of a dimension that is human, that a human can carry, they all sort of become very important in how architecture is made. And so this research is more to go to the origins of the material itself. This is a stupa. This is actually a stupa that was built by the Buddhists. It contains Buddha's relics, and it's normally, a strand of hair or his nail. And again, I was talking about this a little earlier. And then the Mughals came in, and they basically tried to tear it down. Actually, the entire surface at some point, you might be able to see, sorry. You can see there's like these little parts that's basically gold leaf. And what caught my interest was this idea of collective culture, this idea of ceremony, and this idea of passing a thought or passing a language through centuries. But what was important is the ethics or the sort of ethos behind that language that is being transferred through time. So these are pilgrims that come and they put a sheet of gold leaf, and if you could imagine at some point, just as an idea, this entire mass would be covered with gold. So anyway, the Mughals came and they sort of ransacked it and pulled it away, but there came a point, just by its sheer mass, they were not able to actually go through it. And so that idea of depth of field, the idea of the ability to remain present even in a moment where things are being actually eroded or taken out. When I think about the Bamiyan Buddha that we've all seen in Afghanistan, in some way the presence of the negative in some way is far greater than the object itself that occupied it. And for me, I'm fascinated in that idea of, the making of things. How does it have the capacity to endure time? And in time, it's embedded with all the things that we experience and that we all are experiencing in today's time. Am I doing good on time, or is it another 10 minutes? Okay, very quick. So these are pitchforks, and I'm talking about prejudice here, or lack of one. I was in Rajasthan and fascinated with these objects because it's a very precise representation of the hand. In fact, it is the hand itself. It's an extension of the hand, where you can see, just even the sutures, like these markings of the leather that tie these forks, the pitchfork together. So anyway, I'm there and I'm exchanging, money with this gentleman on the right, and I say that how come, you're dressed in this yellow T-shirt while all your relatives and family are dressed in this white cotton shirt? And he says, these guys, they come, they hand out these T-shirts to advertise, it's salesmen, and whether it's Coca-Cola or something else, and that's what's happening in the country right now. I think that's happening everywhere. Anyway, so I sort of take out my, and I exchange money with him, and the next thing I know, he puts his hand into his T-shirt, and I'm looking at him like, wow, how did you do that? So he kind of looks back at me with that same smile. And so I took it home and my wife cut it up. It's sort of like a Lucio Fontana cut, when you think about it. And very beautiful silk satin lining that she put into the pocket. Importantly, if you notice, he still wears this. There are no pockets. It's just cloth that's tied. The T-shirt makes sense. It's cotton. It works in the climate. It's for free. But for me, what's of interest is the ability to observe that both can coexist. What seemed to be a closed space, right? That what seemed to be that, there's no way we're going to be consumed by this economic force that's coming in. He was still able to remain open and find a sort of moment where he could open up another kind of space. And what I like about this particular image is the way that they both coexist, not that different from the ramp and the stairs. You know, that capacity to coexist. Again, these are sort of just landscapes that we see. I'm just sharing that with you in some way that influence some of the work that one does. Actually, this is actually straw or hay that's collected to make MDF, which we discovered much later. This is actually, so the material that's inside is again hay, which is used. It's collected just after the monsoon, just before the monsoons, and stored in these incredible structures. So I'm just sharing that. This is a lime slurry field, or actually a marble slurry field. It's all waste, this image, and this is in Udaipur. But I'm interested in this idea of, you know, canvas, and this is actually a perfect environment where actually a lot of the processes that we did downstairs can actually take place at this scale, you know. So this idea of making lines or measuring distances or making diagrams, you know, very quickly, like from point A to B, a few hundred meters, by the flick of a string, and you make contact by putting the die on the ground. And so again, this is a project that at some day will be realized, but you know, it's just observing these landscapes, and it's been maybe 10 years, you know, and it's only now that one is able to realize the potential of, you know, why one was looking at these things. This is the water actually that settles, because it's, you know, they use water to cut the stone, and these trucks and trucks and trucks are brought and just dumped, and so it becomes this kind of man-made plateau of this sort of marble dust that just sediments. And so the idea is to, in some way, you know, engage with this landscape and be able to do things with it. Self-reliance. We're invested in the notion of self-reliance and its capacity to holistically encompass all spheres of life. Gandhi gave it the content of an integral revolution which should be practiced at different levels. At the individual level, self-reliance is connected with the capacity for unprejudiced self-assessment and continuous self-purification. In its fullest sense, self-reliance is much more than freedom from all restraints. It is self-rule and self-restraint. That idea of, you know, an economy of means that comes from being observant to one's own self in space and time. So these are structures, you know, and it's quite interesting because these people are actually, what they sell is what they inhabit, you know, and once they finish selling all of that, they eventually dismantle that. So it's kind of somewhere between a very nomadic culture, and you still see this in, and if you think about, because we're all at some point, you know, ancestrally, we were all nomads, and they were very reliant or connected to sky, to moon, to sun, and the movement of that, which in some way they were able to read what I was talking about, this idea of language up in the skies. So what we do in the studio is try and mimic in some way and document, you know, just it's more like an archive or a documentation of things that we are viewing in the landscape. So you can see these objects, actually, some of them that we've made, and we try and represent them as close as we can, as a way of just trying to understand. And these are, of course, you know, nomads. They're actually forest dwellers. They've now been displaced from the forest, so they come and work in, you know, in the construction industry, or they come to, you know, till your farm or to build your house. But these are their beginnings of their dwelling. They just basically use the landscape in some way to make a protection. And again, I don't want to give it judgment about the quality or the nature. I think my interest lies in their ability to make a space that can hold them or that can contain them. So you can see what they wear is what they inhabit. You know, it's literally like the next day it's washed and dried, and as a way of, and so the whole thing is sort of interconnected. Their way of life is connected to that idea of materiality. And for me, again, the interest that, you know, man as material, The idea that, we are material, and in the making of something, we embody that material in that process. But what's important is the manner or the way that we make these things. That's what's really being transferred, in doing what we do. So anyway, these are things that I have looked at and continue to look at, and continue to inspire us. You can see, the child's cradle is made from the same fabric, and it's incredible. So it's not limited to just a dress. It becomes a dwelling. It becomes, a container. It becomes, womb-like. And that capacity to understand that idea of warp and weft, the idea of textile. This is quite interesting. It's actually quite difficult. So these people are really marginalized, and they work, they come from very rural, very remote parts of the country, and they come to work on construction sites. And these are all their belongings. And for us, what was interesting was, the height at which these are placed, because what it does is it disables anyone from, because that's all they have. Their food, their clothing, everything is contained in this. And their idea that they've understood the dimension, or the scale, if you want to call it that, in one where there is enough, for someone to be able to steal that will not be so easy. Or if they do, they've calibrated the effort required to displace that object. And so that's what we're actually observing. And I don't want to become drawn into their social condition, but to see and to recognize, even in those marginal situations, how they're able to still be creative in the way that they are able to inhabit, make a living, all of that. For me, this is like a Dali-esque landscape, for me, this is art, this is where that moment where everything just sort of comes together in a very seamless way. It's very direct, it's very rudimentary. It measures the weight of the body. And that's what I'm interested in looking at these images, the way that you traverse this very small landscape, but it's a whole universe unto itself. So a lot of these buildings are actually made from the same ingredients that you see downstairs. It's cow dung, it's lime, it's earth, it's branches, taken from the forest, all woven together by hand. And the reason I'm showing this is because last year's Venice Biennale was about reporting from the front. And it was interesting because I wanted to put an object in that place where, 500,000 architects or 100,000 architects would walk and not be able to recognize that material. That was, and this has universally existed across continents, from Japan to America. I mean, it's been there. Even in Italy, you have similar, maybe the expression is slightly different, but the method or the manner in which it's made is exactly the same. But coming back, so we still have 200 million people living this way now. There's a sense of dignity, there's a sense of culture, there's a sense of continuity, and also a way that they're able to negotiate the environment outside the domain of, economy, in the way that it provokes or forces you to act. And for me, that was really the interesting part of these dwellings. And that relationship of what makes these dwellings, that it's food, everything, it's all interconnected. Constellation, a group of stars on the celestial sphere, forming a pattern traditionally named after its apparent form. An assemblage, collection, or group of usually related entities, qualities, or things. So I leave you with this last clip. For me, it really, in some way, contains our capacity, the idea of the hand, the mind, and the body to collectively come together. And more importantly, it requires the heart. And the coming together, that's the possibility of how we can weave our culture. Thank you.